Last week was the release of The Strangers Chapter 1, the first in a planned trilogy of Strangers movies directed by Rennie Harlan. And while I'm a little late to the party, I did get the chance to check out the movie and I wanted to rank it with the other two Strangers movies from worst to best. In last place is the newest entry in the franchise, The Strangers Chapter 1. And this movie isn't awful or anything, but it's just a much weaker version of the original movie, where the story pretty much follows the beat for beat of the original movie and just does it in a worse way. It feels more like a generic horror movie compared to the original. The original is a very strong independent movie. This feels like it's just a random studio slasher that's made for more mainstream audiences. And it's entertaining when you remake pretty much exactly a good movie. There's some good in it, but just nothing original. And it even takes some ideas from Prey at Night, and some of the original ideas it does have just aren't very interesting. Where it's in the trailer, so don't worry, there's no spoilers here. But the idea of this creepy town, which doesn't really get explored at all, but just the idea of it is not interesting in this franchise because the whole point of The Strangers is this could happen anywhere. It's random. And so when you make it seem like, oh, this whole area is spooky, just doesn't feel like The Strangers. It just feels like any generic horror movie. Feels rather odd in this franchise. And I feel like the acting was fine. Madeline Pesh is good. I'm blanking on his name, but the actor that played the boyfriend, I thought his performance was a little weaker. And I didn't think that the strangers were as scary in this one. I felt like they just kind of popped up and I never was really like afraid of them. There's some tense sequences, but I wasn't really afraid of the actual killers as much compared to the other ones where they're pretty genuinely terrifying. So yeah, it's just the weakest. Not an awful movie, but it's mediocre, fine. Yeah, I hope they go in some new directions in the sequels, and I think they will. So there's a chance the sequels will be better than this movie, and I really hope they are. In second place is The Strangers Prey at Night, and I think this is a solid sequel to the original, but what holds it back is it just feels a little more generic and a little more mainstream, which I said about Chapter 1, but this one is a better version of that. But it still feels like we have an over the top third act, and it doesn't feel like this isolated incident as much as the first, which I really appreciate in that first movie. But I still think it's interesting. It's definitely intense. There's some chase sequences that I really enjoyed in here. I think the chase sequences actually might be better than the first movie, but I really liked that aspect of it. I think the cast is solid. It's fun seeing Lewis Pullman before he is popping up and stuff like Top Gun Maverick and soon to be Thunderbolts. So that's fun. I don't know if I liked the characters too much though. I think just the dynamic of the parents trying to like reconcile their family while at the same time sending their daughter off to boarding school, and that's the point of the trip they're on. That feels a little weird to me where it's hard to pull some of the dramatic family rekindling moments when the whole point of this trip is they were sending the daughter off. So some of the family drama in there is kind of hit or miss for me, and the characters do make pretty bad decisions. That's something that, oh, same with Chapter 1, but I feel like here, just the way they have the characters split up, like this is the one that I think has the weakest character decisions, where this is going down, or someone will tell another character that someone's dead, and instead of believing them, they're like, "Oh, we have to go inspect. We have to split up." Everyone go, yeah. It's just very odd character decisions, and I just think it lacks a little bit of the originality. Where The Strangers was not a movie that probably should have spawned this franchise. It's such a contained story, and it's just supposed to feel like a realistic thing that could happen. It's scary that it's not this over the top slasher. So when we have the killers coming back and it just feels, I don't know, just feels a little less original and just a slasher sequel, which they can be done well. And I think this is a good movie, but it's just not as refreshing and like a fresh breath air for the horror genre like the first was. But I do think there's some really strong scenes, like especially the pool scene that is really intense. And there's something that gets added with the 80s vibe the movie has. I don't know if it fully works, but there's some fun moments where you got the 80s music blasting, some of the imagery. One downside I will say is I thought there was some really weird camera work in the movie, but didn't really bother me, just was kind of odd. I don't know why they made some of those choices in a Strangers movie, but yeah, overall, a good movie, but can't compare to that original. And pretty easily in first place is The Strangers. And I don't think that should surprise anyone from the little hints I've given when I'm talking about the other movies in this franchise. It's pretty obvious that for me, this movie is the best of the franchise. It's just such a strong horror thriller, and it just really pulls you in to the world and to this scenario. I just love how this movie makes you just feel like you're in the room, you're into this scenario. And it just feels so realistic and disturbing. It's not this huge horror setup. It's these people in this cabin and they just start getting messed with. It doesn't go for any big reveals, doesn't go for any huge motivations. It's just this act of violence that is randomly committed on this couple. And that makes it so scary because it feels so realistic and just it's genuinely terrifying. The violence when it happens feels just so real and it just sudden, and it's so, like I said, so effective, this movie. The imagery, there's a classic shot of the bag-headed stranger standing in the background while Liv Tyler's in the kitchen. That is terrifying, and the movie just builds dread, and it's never boring. We know these strangers are lingering around, and it just slowly has us just terrified. We don't know what's going to happen next, and it's just a really well done movie. I think the pace, it doesn't overstay its welcome with that runtime. I think the pacing is great. I think the acting is really solid, and it's just such a well-made movie where it's an independent movie that has very much a slasher vibe to it, but it really just feels like this claustrophobic thriller where it doesn't really have many of the cliches of the slasher genre. It's this really intense and just thrilling situation. Like the movie almost plays out in real time, where obviously it doesn't fully, but you just feel like you're with these characters for the entirety of this situation, and you just feel the dread building. And by the time you get to sunrise, it's just an intense plot. And I think that they just knew how to use the strangers really well, where they didn't use them as these big like horror icons. They didn't try to set up horror icons with it. They just try to have these simple characters that sure wear masks, but they don't wear masks like a gimmick to make them slasher icons. It genuinely feels like they're just doing that to hide their identity, and that they're these random people. They're not the silent masked killers. They speak, but not tons, but it just makes it stand out. It just feels a little different than most slashers, and it's just really a really good horror movie. I think it's very, very much would recommend it. I think it's a really, really good movie. And I think even if you're not a huge horror fan, sure, there's scares, but honestly, this one, I always thought it was more of a thriller where it more relies on just keeping you at this really intense just level of just like dread, but never feeling like it's totally jump scare reliant. I think it's more just this really well done, intense thriller. And yeah, like I said, highly recommend, and this definitely tops my list. Thank you so much for checking out my video. Please like and subscribe, and be sure to let me know in the comments, what did you think of the new entry in the franchise, Chapter 1? Do you have interest in Chapter 2 and 3, and how you would rank these 3 movies so far?